Tyson Foods is America's biggest meat company, processing chicken, beef, and pork for grocery stores and restaurants across the country. For decades, they've been a major employer in small American towns, providing steady jobs and supporting local economies. But in the last 2 years, everything changed. Tyson closed more than 12 meat processing plants and fired over 5,000 workers. This wasn't just about losing jobs, it was about destroying entire communities that had built their lives around these factories. The closures hit hardest in rural areas where Tyson was often the largest employer. These were the same communities that had voted for politicians who promised to bring manufacturing jobs back to America. Instead, they watched their economic lifelines disappear almost overnight. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button to stay updated on important stories like this that affect working families across America. What happened to workers? The way Tyson handled these closures was particularly cruel. Workers who had dedicated years or even decades to the company were given almost no warning and very little support. In Perry, Iowa, 300 families woke up one morning to find an email in their inbox. The message was short and cold: their plant was closing immediately. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, these were real people with mortgages, car payments, and children to feed. Workers who had shown up faithfully for years, working in difficult conditions processing meat, suddenly found themselves unemployed with no plan for what came next. In Noel, Missouri, the situation was even more devastating. The town has barely 2,000 residents, and Tyson's chicken plant employed 500 of them. When the plant closed, it meant that 1 in 4 people in the entire town lost their job at the same time. Imagine if a quarter of everyone you knew suddenly became unemployed on the same day. That's what happened in Noel. Dexter, Missouri faced a similar crisis when Tyson closed its poultry facility, eliminating 683 jobs in a town of 8,000 people. That's nearly 10% of the entire population losing their income source simultaneously. Most workers received only a small severance payment and a link to a job training website. No career counseling, no help finding new employment, no support for families suddenly facing financial crisis. Many had to choose between uprooting their entire lives to follow jobs elsewhere or staying in their communities and facing unemployment. Why did this happen? The root cause of these closures traces back to President Trump's trade policies. Trump believed that putting high taxes, called tariffs, on goods coming from other countries would force companies to build more factories in America. The idea was simple: if foreign products became too expensive, companies would have no choice but to make things here at home. However, the reality was much more complicated. When Trump imposed tariffs of 10% on all imports, doubled steel tariffs to 50%, and added extra duties on food, farm equipment, and packaging from Europe, China, and Mexico, he created a domino effect that hurt American manufacturers. The tariffs made everything more expensive for companies like Tyson. Steel for their equipment and machinery cost more. Transportation became pricier because trucks and trains needed more expensive parts. Animal feed went up in price because the equipment used to grow, store, and transport feed was affected by tariffs. Even the packaging materials for meat products became costlier. Instead of encouraging Tyson to build new plants in America, these higher costs forced the company to look for ways to cut expenses. The easiest way to do that was to close older, less efficient plants and lay off American workers. How towns were hurt. When Tyson left these communities, the damage went far beyond the factory workers who lost their jobs. These plants were the economic engines that kept entire towns running. Local businesses that depended on Tyson workers as customers began to struggle immediately. Restaurants that served lunch to factory workers saw their sales drop by half. Gas stations that relied on Tyson trucks and employee traffic lost major revenue streams. Grocery stores watched their sales plummet as hundreds of families suddenly had no income to spend. The housing market collapsed in these towns. When people lose their jobs, they often have to sell their homes and move elsewhere to find work. But when hundreds of people try to sell their houses at the same time in a small town, there aren't enough buyers. Home values dropped, and many families found themselves owing more on their mortgages than their houses were worth. Schools faced budget crises because they depend on property taxes from local businesses and homeowners. In Perry, Iowa, the school district had to freeze hiring, cut after-school programs, and raise student lunch fees. They couldn't afford to maintain their buildings or buy new textbooks and supplies. Local governments also struggled. Towns like Dexter, Missouri had to pause road repairs and cancel downtown improvement projects because they lost so much tax revenue when Tyson left. In Perry, The town lost 20% of its total income when the plant closed. Even churches and charitable organizations were overwhelmed. Food banks that usually helped a few dozen families each month suddenly had hundreds of newly unemployed people seeking assistance. Many ran out of supplies within weeks of the plant closures. The human cost. The most heartbreaking part of this story involves the immigrant and refugee families who worked at these plants. Nearly 60% of Tyson's workforce in Perry, Iowa were immigrants and refugees from countries like Sudan, Eritrea, and Central America. These families had come to America seeking better lives and opportunities for their children. They had done everything right. They worked hard, paid taxes, bought homes, sent their kids to local schools, and became part of their communities. Many had fled war, poverty, or persecution in their home countries, and the steady work at Tyson represented the American dream they had hoped to find. When the plants closed, these families faced impossible choices. Some had to uproot their children from the only schools they had ever known and move hundreds of miles away, hoping to find work at other Tyson plants or similar factories. Others decided to stay in their communities and face unemployment, not wanting to disrupt their children's education or leave behind the social networks they had built. For many immigrant families, the job loss was particularly devastating because they had fewer connections and resources to fall back on. They couldn't easily move in with extended family or rely on generational wealth to weather the crisis. Some faced the possibility of losing their homes, their cars, and their children's college funds. The stress took a toll on families and communities. Teachers reported more children coming to school hungry. Local sheriff's offices saw increases in domestic disputes and petty theft, problems that often arise when economic stress overwhelms families. Mental health services were stretched thin as people struggled with depression, anxiety, and feelings of abandonment. Where did the money go? While thousands of workers lost their livelihoods, Tyson's executives and shareholders continued to prosper. This contrast highlighted the growing inequality between corporate leadership and ordinary workers. Tyson's CEO, Donnie King, earned $12 million in 2024, nearly 300 times what the average Tyson worker made in a year. This included his salary, bonuses, and stock awards. While workers in Perry and Knoll were visiting food banks and struggling to pay rent, King was collecting millions in compensation. The company also received massive government subsidies. Tyson secured over $250 million in direct federal subsidies from USDA programs meant to support agriculture. When you add in supply chain support and federal disaster relief, Tyson received over $3 billion in government-backed aid in less than 2 years. Taxpayers were essentially paying Tyson to stay in business, even as the company was laying off taxpayers by the thousands. Tyson didn't just take government money, they also spent heavily on lobbying to influence politicians. In 2025 alone, the company spent over $2 million lobbying lawmakers in Washington. They targeted the USDA, OSHA, and the Department of Commerce, trying to weaken worker safety rules, limit environmental regulations, and protect their profits from tariff impacts. While workers stood outside closed plants wondering how they'd pay their bills, Tyson's lobbyists sat in fancy Washington offices negotiating tax breaks and trade deals to benefit shareholders. The company was taking care of its executives and investors while abandoning the workers and communities that had made their success possible. What about farmers? The damage wasn't limited to factory workers. Small farmers who raised animals for Tyson also faced financial ruin. These farmers had invested their life savings and taken out huge loans to build the facilities Tyson required. When Tyson decided to expand, they encouraged farmers to build new chicken houses, pig barns, and cattle facilities. Farmers like Sean Hinkle in Missouri borrowed millions of dollars to construct the buildings Tyson requested, believing they had secure, long-term contracts. Then Tyson suddenly canceled these contracts when they closed plants. Farmers were left with massive debts and no way to pay them back. They had barns full of animals but nowhere to sell them. Some tried to find other buyers, but that meant accepting much lower prices that wouldn't cover their costs. Many farmers faced foreclosure on their family farms, land that had been in their families for generations. Local banks, which had been willing to finance these projects when Tyson backed them, now warned that agricultural loans were too risky. Some farmers had to destroy their livestock because they couldn't afford to feed them and had no buyers. The Missouri Independent Investigation found dozens of farms in Missouri and Arkansas facing repossession after Tyson pulled out. These weren't corporate farms, they were family operations that had trusted Tyson's promises and paid the price when the company changed its strategy. Food got more expensive. The tariffs that caused Tyson to close plants also made food more expensive for everyone. According to the Federal Reserve, food manufacturing costs increased by 6.8% year-over-year due to tariffs on steel, aluminum, and agricultural goods. School lunch programs were hit particularly hard. Districts in Kansas reported having to cut meat portions from student meals because they couldn't afford Tyson's new wholesale prices. In Arkansas, cafeteria managers had to substitute cheaper proteins or raise lunch prices for parents who were already struggling with inflation. Rural grocery stores faced especially difficult choices. In Noel, Missouri, the only supermarket saw chicken sales drop 40% when Tyson closed its plant. In Perry, Iowa, grocers who had been buying Tyson pork had to find suppliers from other states, driving up costs. Small grocery stores can't negotiate the same low prices that big chains can, so they had to raise prices or reduce their selection. The irony was clear: Trump's trade policies, which were supposed to help American workers, ended up making it more expensive for American families to buy food. The tariffs that closed Tyson plants also made the remaining food more costly. The broken promise. President Trump had campaigned on bringing manufacturing jobs back to America. He promised that tariffs would force companies to build factories here instead of overseas. At rallies in Ohio and Pennsylvania, he told crowds that foreign nations were stealing our factories and that tariffs were the only way to stop them. But the reality was completely different. Since 2023, Tyson has closed 8 U.S. plants and laid off more than 5,000 workers. During the same period, not a single new Tyson meat processing plant has opened in the United States. The company has actually expanded overseas, announcing new investments in Thailand, China, and the Netherlands. Even within the U.S., Tyson shifted production from unionized plants in the Midwest to non-union facilities in the South, where wages and safety standards were lower. Arkansas plants received new investment while Iowa, Indiana, and Missouri facilities were shuttered. The Federal Reserve had warned this would happen. A 2024 study found that previous Trump tariffs had cost the U.S. manufacturing sector 75,000 jobs between 2018 and 2020. Tariffs raised prices, squeezed profit margins, and made American products less competitive in global markets. What's next? The story isn't over. As of mid-2025, Tyson is still reviewing other plants in Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and Texas. Industry analysts expect more closures if costs remain high and demand continues to weaken. Trump's latest tariff threats against European meat imports could trigger new trade wars, further shrinking Tyson's overseas markets. If that happens, more American jobs could be eliminated as the company continues to prioritize profits over workers. Other industries are watching Tyson's story closely. The lesson seems clear: protectionist policies that ignore market realities often backfire, and the people who suffer most are working families who can least afford it. The real impact. This story reveals the harsh reality of how economic policies affect real people. Politicians make promises about protecting American workers, but when those policies fail, it's not the politicians who lose their jobs, it's the factory workers, the farmers, and the small business owners who trusted those promises. The towns that were promised protection and revival instead got empty factories and broken dreams. Families who believed in America First policies found themselves abandoned when those policies proved to be economically destructive. The contrast between Tyson's corporate success and the suffering of its workers and communities shows how our economic system often rewards those who already have wealth and power while punishing those who do the actual work. While executives collected millions and shareholders saw their investments protected, the people who actually produced the food that made Tyson profitable were left to figure out how to survive on their own. These aren't just statistics or economic data points, they're American families whose lives were turned upside down by decisions made in corporate boardrooms and political offices far from their communities. Their story is a reminder that behind every policy decision and corporate strategy are real people with real lives. And when those decisions go wrong, it's those people who pay the price. If you found this story important, please subscribe to our channel and share it with others. Stories like this need to be told. And your support helps us continue bringing you the truth about what's happening to working families in America. Don't forget to hit the like button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest updates.